So it's now my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Jason Colby.
Over the past year, we've heard many claims of how the candidacy of Donald Trump was unprecedented. His rhetoric and platform, we were told, was something new under the sun, part of an angry populist surge that was happening throughout the industrial West. And in fact, our poster here promised to make sense of this new populism we're seeing. But I want to take my time here to actually place Trump in what I would call the American grain. For despite appearances, Trump's populism has deep roots in the history of the United States. When U.S. historians refer to populism, usually big P, capital P populism, they usually mean the rural political revolt of the 1890s that reframed some of American politics. But in truth, the populism we're seeing today is, certainly in the United States, is as old as the nation itself. In fact, some of it's older. Anti-immigrant sentiment, well, you could say anti-immigrant sentiment goes back to the First Nations in the U.S., but the populist rhetoric itself, especially toward the government and toward fears of a large, empowered government, are actually built into the political culture of the United States. If you think about it, it's a nation that truly was founded by populist rhetoric. It was founded ultimately on discomfort, fear, and mobilization against centralized power, in that case, against the central British state. And that fear, that version of populist rhetoric has cropped up in many eras in American history. The one that always leaps to mind, and I think in some ways this is probably the best historical comparison to Donald Trump, is Andrew Jackson, who dominated and in many ways remade American politics in the 1830s, largely on a very racially charged promise to make the government work for the people, and specifically what he called the common man, by which he meant white men, and in particular white men who worked. The first one, like I mentioned, is fear of centralized government power. I mean, you can't understand American politics without understanding that. Second, and certainly related, but not always the same thing, is a distrust of the political and economic elite. The third, and this can take many definitions, but I'm going to throw this one out, is really an unabashed, you could call it Americanism, a nationalism, embodied by the people. And the fourth that we see crop up again and again is fear of some sort of insidious foreign influence. I would also argue that U.S. populism, as I'm defining it and as historians understand it, has always carried within it pretty powerful racial inflections. And this is also really important to understand when you see how arguments about government power take shape in the United States. Simply put, fear of central government power, fear of the federal government, has always had the greatest traction among white Americans. People of color, in contrast, and most specifically African Americans throughout American history, have tended to view the federal government as a potential, not always a consistent, but a potential guarantor of rights and opportunities. If you think about it, of course, it was the federal government that limited the spread of slavery, that ultimately extinguished slavery. It is to the federal courts that civil rights organizations ultimately looked for desegregation rulings, from the 1930s through the 1960s. Whereas it's been much more common for white Americans, particularly in rural areas, particularly in the South, to see federal encroachment, federal power as ultimately a threat to freedom rather than a guarantor of it. Joseph McCarthy spoke to it when he denounced the government elite that controlled U.S. policy. And figures such as Barry Goldwater in the mid-1960s spoke to it when they spoke of the distrust of the rising liberal state, especially with regard to civil rights reform in the Great Society, the expanding of the liberal state. For these and many other reasons, the Republican Party enjoyed extraordinary support, surprising support from voters who became known as the Reagan Democrats in the 1980s and the early 1990s. And I know this phenomenon well. I grew up in one of these families. In fact, cast my first vote for Ross Perot because the first Bush was too liberal for me. Chew on that one. The 9/11 attacks left Americans traumatized and frightened, while the wars that followed proved contentious and confusing and expensive. And then came the nearly simultaneous events of the 2008 Great Recession, which for Americans, much more than Canadians, most Canadians can even imagine, came with astonishing collapse in the housing market. The 2008 Great Recession and the simultaneous election of Barack Obama. Now, that housing meltdown devastated many middle-class and working-class families who had seen, in many ways, their home values as their retirement, a core source for retirement. And that happened even as Obama, his very presence in the White House, seemed to crystallize longtime fears of the liberal state. Spurred on by partisan news and outspoken conservative talk radio, many Americans concluded that this man with his strange name and unfamiliar background, certainly the middle name Hussein, that this man would cater not just to people of color, right, that had long been in association with the liberal state for many white conservatives, but that this man would ultimately also cater to international interests. And perhaps, some argued, some claimed, perhaps he was a little too international himself. Maybe he was, in fact, not even an American citizen. And of course, it was Donald Trump who capitalized on these fears. He became the ringleader of the birther conspiracy theory. And he launched his campaign, we should remember, in the lobby of the Trump Tower, with racially charged rhetoric toward Latino and Muslim immigrants. The bulk of Trump voters, either whether they lived through them or just remember them through an imaginary nostalgia, they seem to look to the 1950s for their inspiration. When they imagine industry was thriving, Americans built stuff, and other Americans bought that stuff. And implicitly, and this is not true of all Trump voters, but it's true of a heck of a lot of them, the 1950s were a time when people of color and women knew their place. But now, of course, as leader of that movement that's in power, Donald Trump is in the process of discovering that it's much easier to be a figurehead than it is to translate populism, angry populism, into a coherent program of government. And finally, I would argue, if you recall, one of my currents of populism that I pointed to at the very beginning, right after Andrew Jackson, was much of populist mobilization has often taken shape around fear of foreign influence. And as an American historian, and I've quizzed other American historians this week and run up to this, I cannot think of, nor can my friends and colleagues think of, another president that has come to power and tried to exercise power under a greater specter, or not just a rumor, a specter of foreign influence. And that may prove to be ultimately the greatest challenge of all.
On elections day, what we really do is give our power away to a representative. Then when the representative fails to do what I want him to do or her to do, then I get angry. But if we had direct democracy, legislation by referendum, then we would be at fault.
I think there's some insight and truth to that. I hesitate to totally agree with you because when it comes to sort of the states in the United States that have direct referendums and like California, some really unfortunate consequences have taken place. I mean, one of the great insights of the American system is in many ways that you can't trust the majority with the rights of the minority. And so if you put everything, including the privileges and rights of others, in the hands of their fellow citizens, if they can be depicted as others, then fellow citizens can sometimes take those rights away.
We have the human Charter of Human Rights by the UN. Won't that defend minorities?
The UN Charter of Human Rights, which the United States was central in framing, has never had any true kind of enforcement power, sadly, within sort of sovereign nations. I mean, it's been used to frame interventions, but the United States has never once made a decision about civil or human rights based on the Charter of Human Rights. Important though it is as a shared statement of our values, right, internationally.
Right. But on elections day, we abide by the majority, the will of the majority. And,
sometimes, but the majority didn't win in the U.S., right? Or the
okay, but in elections we do give the benefit of the doubt to the people and say people know what they are doing. Maybe they don't, but we believe that they do. But when it comes to legislation, we're afraid of giving people the right to legislate.
Yeah, I mean, it's the tension between democracy and representative government that's sort of at the heart of our systems of government since we've done away with monarchy. From the American perspective, democracy was always considered. I mean, the word democracy doesn't appear in any U.S. founding documents. The direct rule of the people was actually always considered a threat to interests, both property interests, minority interests. At the same time, there are certainly sort of parts of our government that you could argue would benefit from more direct democracy. Absolutely. There are dangers too in the United States. It's worth asking whether should the rights of African Americans in Georgia be sort of up to the decision of the white majority in Georgia, right? Would there still be segregation if there was direct democracy in Georgia as opposed to distant federal officials making those decisions?
Well, there comes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So but
that's never had force in Georgia or any other U.S. state. I mean, it's never. I agree with you. I think that's. Yeah. I mean, I'm a huge fan of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but it's never had. The United States has never recognized it as having sort of the force of law to shape, legal relations or rights in the United States.
Are you afraid that the majority of whites would overrule the Human Rights Declaration?
Yeah, I am.
You are? Okay.
At least on the state-by-state basis. Yes.
Okay, thank you.